Hello class, this is Jim Turner, your professor, and I'm bringing you video number 1 of 3. And this covers a portion of what we call the cheat sheet, which summarizes the material that we've learned in class concerning financial statements. So let's get right to it. Who makes the rules with respect to financial statements and financial accounting in general? In the private sector and in the nonprofit sector, the rulemaking body is known as FASB. That stands for the Financial Accounting Standards Board. In the public sector, whether you're dealing with the newer GASB 34 statements or the governmental traditional statements, the rulemaking body is known as GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. One of the more important items deals with measurement, focus, and basis of accounting. You'll hear me use the term MFBA. The first half of that deals with the measurement focus, and the measurement focus describes what is being measured. In the private sector, they use an economic resource measurement focus, and you're measuring both short and long-term assets and liabilities. In the public sector, for the newer GASB 34 statements, you have the exact same economic resource focus. Again, covering both short and long-term assets and liabilities. In the traditional public sector statements, it uses a different measurement focus. It uses one called the flow of current financial resources. This is a short-term focus, which is the nature of government. Government doesn't have a profit motive. The real motive deals with stewardship. Has the public's money been used appropriately? And stewardship helps us determine if current resources are available to satisfy current obligations. So the measurement focus here is one of short-term nature, and it's called the flow of current financial resources. The basis of accounting, which is the second half of the MFBA. In the private sector, we use accrual or full accrual. Remember, you're not talking about a cash basis accounting, and we'll deal with that in a little more detail later on. Both the nonprofit sector and the public sector also use accrual or full accrual accounting. However, the traditional public sector statements use a modified accrual basis of accounting. Items have to be both measurable and available, and we'll talk more on that also later. So when do we record revenues? In the private sector, when they're earned. And again, I want to make the distinction. This is not a cash basis. If you're a small mom and pop store and you use cash basis of accounting, it's fairly simple. Revenues are recorded when you receive cash, and expenses are recorded when you pay out cash. But that's different than what we're going to see in these various sectors. So the private sector uses their terminology, is known as has the revenue been earned. In the nonprofit sector, for the most part, they use the same revenue recording rules, although certain grants follow a different set of rules dealing more with when they have been received. The GASB 34 statements, as we see throughout this, also have the same revenue recording rules as the private sector. And once again, the traditional public sector statements follow a different set of rules. Here, in order to record revenue, it has to be both measurable and available, and again, relating to the short-term focus that government has in terms of determining whether the public's money, the tax money, has been used appropriately. Expenses versus expenditures is another important distinction that we need to make. In the private sector, we record expenses that are associated with cost. So let me give you an example. If you're buying a headquarters building, and let's say it's going to cost you $20 million and you're going to use the building over at least the next 20 years, you're going to record an expense, specifically a depreciation expense, each year over the life of the building. So $1 million will show as an expense in each year for the next $20 million, for the next 20 years, In the nonprofit sector, they use the similar expense notation. They also report expenses by function. The GASB 34 similarly uses expenses terminology, but in the public sector we see a new wording, expenditures. And by expenditures we mean a payment or a promise to pay soon. Now that's different than expenses, which are associated with the terminology, with the concept of cost. An expenditure is typically a cash payment or a payment that's going to occur shortly. This summarizes what we've just reviewed for the first cheat sheet. We covered who governs, we covered the measurement, focus, and basis of accounting, and finally we talked about when revenues and expenses or expenditures are recorded. The next cheat sheet video will cover the financial statements as well as the accounting equation that is used in the various financial statements. And finally, the third video will cover 3 major transactions and show how they are recorded differently between the private sector and the public sector. So that's the end of video 1. Study hard and good luck.